The text hit at 2:14 p.m., right as my screen filled with budget lines for the new climate change exhibition, and the museum's inbox began its usual avalanche of requests. Outside my third-floor window, the National Mall stretched toward the Capitol like a clean postcard, all marble and confidence, the kind of view people assumed belonged to someone else. My phone buzzed once, then again, and I saw Derek's name. About New Year's Eve. We're keeping it small this year. Just Rebecca's political crowd. You understand, I read it twice, feeling the message sharpen into something more than a plan. Derek, 2 years younger, had never been subtle, but this was pointed in a way that made my stomach go still. 2 months ago, he had gotten engaged to Rebecca Chin, a newly elected congresswoman with donors, colleagues, and cameras orbiting her like moons. Derek had already decided I didn't fit the picture. Not the right level he'd implied before, like I was some background character who should be grateful for a later dinner invitation. I set the phone down and stared at my office door, already counting the minutes to my next meeting, the next decision, the next responsibility that would keep the museum moving. Derek didn't ask what I actually did. He never had. And part of me was tired of explaining, tired of being reduced to museum stuff by the people who were supposed to know me best. But another part of me, the quieter and more dangerous part, wondered what would happen when Rebecca finally learned the truth in a room full of powerful people. Would she feel embarrassed for believing Derek or furious at him for selling a story that kept me small? And if the truth came out at the worst possible moment, would it change their engagement or change my family forever? Derek was always the bright one in our parents' eyes, the easy laugh at dinner, the kid who could charm a teacher into extending a deadline and still get praised for being resourceful. I was the quiet one, the one who read too much and asked inconvenient questions, the one who chose museum studies and cultural anthropology while everyone else chased titles that sounded expensive. My mother used to say it like a compliment that never quite landed. At least you will have a nice quiet job? The joke was that nothing about my work had ever been quiet. 4 years ago, I was appointed executive director of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, a role that meant managing a complex institution with global partnerships, scientific research, public education, cultural diplomacy, and a budget large enough to make most people blink. I oversaw teams that never slept because history and science do not pause just because families decide you are convenient to misunderstand. But Derek never asked what I did. Not once. In his mind, I worked at a museum the way a person works at an airport, somewhere in the background, useful but invisible. When he started dating Rebecca Chin, it got worse because now my life did not just bore him, it threatened his narrative. Rebecca was rising fast, a newly elected congresswoman with a future that looked like headlines. Derek wanted to stand beside her as the impressive fiancée, and in that picture, I could only exist as the harmless sister with a quaint career. The night I met Rebecca at a family dinner, Derek introduced me with a smile that kept everything small. This is my sister, Sarah. She works at the Natural History Museum. Rebecca was polite in that way politicians master early. Oh, how nice. Museums are so important. Then she turned to take a call, already in campaign mode, already building the next room she would walk into. I did not correct Derek. I did not say, actually, I run it. I had tried for years to correct my family's assumptions and learned that facts do not matter when people prefer the version of you that lets them feel comfortable. Then came the text about New Year's Eve, the one that made the air in my office feel thinner. Derek was not just excluding me. He was framing it as a favor to me and a necessity for Rebecca. Her colleagues are coming. Donors, representatives. It is not the same level. I should have been angry, but what I felt first was a tired kind of clarity. This was not about a party. It was about Derek deciding again that I did not belong in a room he wanted to control. And the injustice was subtle enough to sound reasonable if you did not look too closely. We will do dinner next month, just us. Rebecca wants to get to know you better. He said it like I was an optional appointment, like I could be scheduled and rescheduled without consequence. Meanwhile, my calendar was a wall of obligations that actually shaped the museum's future. In January, we were hosting the International Museum Directors Summit, bringing global leaders from institutions like the Louvre and the British Museum to Washington. The State Department cared, the Smithsonian secretary cared, the press cared. And before Derek even realized it, Rebecca's office was going to care too, because she chaired a subcommittee tied directly to arts and culture funding. The problem was simple and brutal. Derek had built a lie that was convenient for him, and Rebecca had trusted it. So when the truth finally surfaced, it would not just embarrass Derek. It would force everyone to answer a harder question. Was he careless, or was he deliberately keeping me small to protect his pride? I didn't tell Derek anything about the summit at first. Not because I was plotting some petty gotcha, but because my life was already running at a speed that didn't leave room for explaining myself to someone determined not to listen. The 10 days after New Year's were a blur of rehearsed calm and real pressure. My mornings started with security briefings and delegate itineraries, my afternoons disappeared into donor calls and exhibition approvals, and my nights were spent editing remarks that needed to sound warm, steady, and inevitable. Like America still knew how to lead with culture instead of chaos. 50 museum directors meant 50 competing needs, special protection protocols, private meetings, dietary requirements, diplomatic sensitivities, and egos polished sharp by decades of being the smartest person in the room. This was the part people never understood about museums. The artifacts were the romance. The leadership was the diplomacy. While Derek imagined museum stuff, I was balancing national optics, international relationships, and the quiet, relentless reality that cultural institutions survive on trust. And in that grind, I started planting pieces into place without even thinking of them as a plan. I confirmed the opening reception timeline. I arranged the flags in the main hall for the press, moment I knew Rebecca's team would want. I updated my staff to route all high-level inquiries straight through my office so nothing got lost in the bureaucracy. I briefed Jennifer to keep my schedule clean the morning of January 13th, because if Rebecca's office wanted a private tour, they'd get the real version of me, not the watered-down one Derek had been selling. Then, on January 3rd, Jennifer stepped in with that look that meant something political had just collided with our world. Congresswoman Chin's office called. They want a private tour with you personally leading it. January 13th at 10 a.m. Confirm it. My pen paused over the agenda like the ink itself hesitated. The timing was perfect, almost cinematic, a day before the summit when the museum would feel like a stage being set. And I could have warned Derek, could have said, by the way, your fiancé is coming to meet me in my actual capacity. But something in me refused. Not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. If Derek wanted to keep me small, he could keep trying. I wasn't going to perform my own identity for him anymore. When Jennifer asked if she should mention to Rebecca's office that we were related, I said no, not as a challenge, but as a boundary. If it mattered, it would come up. I spent the next week building momentum like a wave. I finalized the delegate list. I approved exhibition proposals that would anchor our next year of programming. I coordinated with the Smithsonian Secretary's office and protocol teams. I made sure my bio and official materials were ready for every press kit and staff binder because in rooms like these, legitimacy isn't claimed, it's documented. And then on January 10th, Derek called his tone casual in a way that made my spine tighten. Rebecca mentioned she's doing some tour at your museum next week. The thing is, she doesn't really know you work there. She knows you work at a museum, but she thinks you're like a coordinator or something, maybe the gift shop. Just don't make it weird. Don't mention we're related. She's nervous about meeting international VIPs. I didn't argue. I just let the silence do the work. Because the truth was, Derek had already made it weird. He'd made it weird years ago by refusing to learn who I was. And now, without realizing it, he'd walked his fiancée into a room where the version of me he invented couldn't survive. So I did what I always did when stakes were high. I stayed calm, kept building, and let the truth sit in place like a trapdoor, quietly waiting for the moment when it would open. January 13th arrived cold and bright, the kind of winter morning that makes Washington look sharper than it feels. I dressed with the same discipline I used before a Senate hearing, charcoal suit hair pulled back, nothing that asked for approval. By 9:45, Jennifer had already run the choreography. Motorcades here, security's escorting her up. Chief of Staff, 2 aides, and a press liaison. Press, of course. Rebecca's team wasn't coming to learn quietly. They were coming to be seen learning. They wanted photos under the international flags in the main hall, good optics for her new role, proof that she belonged in rooms with global influence. At 9:58, the security desk called. Dr. Mitchell, Congresswoman Chin's party is in the main lobby ready for you. The museum wasn't open to the public yet, which meant the vast hall felt like a cathedral before service-polished floors, echoing footsteps, the kind of silence that makes every small moment sound larger than it is. I walked in and saw her immediately. Rebecca Chin looked exactly like the version of herself America had just elected, controlled, camera-ready navy blazer confident stance, speaking with her press liaison as if she could already see the headline. Her chief of staff noticed me first, a sharp-eyed man who had spent his life reading Power before people spoke. Dr. Mitchell, he said, offering his hand. Tom Bradford, thank you for accommodating this tour. I shook his hand, then turned to Rebecca with the same professional calm I used with foreign ministers. Congresswoman Chin. Welcome to the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Executive Director. Rebecca's political smile was already in place, automatic as breathing. Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for then her expression froze mid-sentence, like the words hit a wall she hadn't known existed. Her eyes widened by a fraction not dramatic enough for the cameras, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the cost of surprise. Mitchell, she said slowly. Sarah Mitchell. Yes! Her gaze sharpened and the air between us tightened. As in Derek's sister, I didn't gloat. I didn't even move. I just let the truth stand there in full daylight. Yes. For a moment, nobody spoke. Tom Bradford looked confused. The aides traded quick glances. The press liaison kept her camera raised, uncertain whether this was a photo op or a political mistake. Rebecca swallowed, trying to recover her footing. Derek said you worked at a museum. He didn't mention that you run it. No, he wouldn't have mentioned that, I said gently. He doesn't actually know what I do here. I watched her composure crack at the edges, embarrassment flashing into something darker realization than anger that had nowhere safe to land. But there was no time to linger in personal shock because Rebecca's staff was already pivoting back into purpose. Congresswoman Tom said smoothly, "Shall we begin?" And so we did. I led them through the main exhibitions, but I didn't give the watered-down visitor script. I gave them the institution, the machinery behind the marble. I explained our mission and the scale of it, research labs that produced knowledge collections that demanded ethics, public education, that shaped national understanding. Rebecca asked smart questions, clearly well briefed, but each answer forced her to see the gap between what Derek told her and what was standing in front of her. In the ocean hall beneath the suspended whale, I talked about climate research and public education, how we weren't just displaying fossils, we were translating science into policy relevance. We advised Congress. I said without bravado, like it was just another line on the job description. Rebecca repeated it, like she couldn't quite believe it. You advise Congress, yes. I've testified before appropriations. Tom Bradford started typing notes faster. When we reached my office suite overlooking the mall with books lining the walls and briefing folders stacked like quiet storms, Rebecca stood still, taking it in as if she'd stepped into someone else's life by mistake. "This is where you work," she said almost to herself. "This is who you are." And I could see it landing all at once. Derek had excluded the wrong person for the wrong reason, and he'd done it in a way that made her complicit. That was the real crisis now, not a family misunderstanding, but a crack in the foundation of the story she thought she was marrying into. Then, as if the universe wanted to tighten the screws, Jennifer knocked and delivered a string of names that belonged to the Summit Louvre Protocol foreign delegations. Rebecca's eyes flicked to me, and for the first time, her polished mask slipped enough to show distress. She asked quietly if we could have a moment alone. Tom and the aides stepped out. When the door closed, she sat down, like her body finally admitted the weight of what she'd walked into. "Derek told me you worked in a gift shop," she said, voice tight with shame and disbelief. The words hung in the room like smoke, and I realized this wasn't just Derek being clueless. This was Derek building a world where my achievements didn't exist, because if they did, his entire sense of himself would have to change. Rebecca looked up at me, eyes glossy but focused. "I am so embarrassed," she said, and I didn't know yet whether she was embarrassed for herself or furious enough to burn down the lie that brought her here. Rebecca didn't cry. Not the way movies teach you to expect. Her eyes were red, her breathing measured, and the anger that rose in her wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. She paced once, then stopped at my window and looked out at the mall like she was recalculating an entire map of reality. "Derek told me you were sweet," she said, almost spitting the word like it had been used as a leash. "Sweet, but flaky. That you bounced around, that you were happy doing something small." She turned back to me, jaw tight, and I believed him because I trusted the person I was going to marry. She swallowed. "I did not do the basic thing I do for a living. I did not research. I did not verify. I just took his word." Then her voice dropped, "And he used that trust to make you invisible." The sentence hit harder than any insult Derek had ever thrown because it named the damage cleanly. Invisible. Not just dismissed, but edited out. In the hallway outside my office, I could hear Tom Bradford murmuring to the aides, keeping the staff machine running, while the personal crisis unfolded behind a closed door. That contrast, the professionalism outside and the rupture inside, was the entire story of my life with my family. I had built credibility in public rooms while being minimized in private ones. Rebecca exhaled and looked at her phone like it was a weapon she was finally ready to use. She stepped into the small conference room Jennifer offered and made the call. When she came back 20 minutes later, her eyes were clearer and her expression was set. "I asked him what his sister does," she said. "He was not sure." "Not sure." She let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. "I asked if he knew you have a PhD. He said, maybe." "I asked if he knew you were executive director. He thought you were a department director." Then she stared at me, the shame on her face now mixing with fury. "Sarah, he did not just misunderstand you. He chose a version of you that made him feel bigger. And he fed that version to me." Her voice tightened. "I told him the wedding is postponed." The word postponed echoed like a gavel. Not canceled, not but paused under bright lights. She wasn't just reacting as a fiancée, she was reacting as a public figure who had built her platform on recognition, dignity, and equality, and now realized she was about to marry a man who could not grant those things to his own sister. Outside my office, the museum kept moving. Emails arrived, delegates demanded answers, the summit clock kept ticking. But inside this small space, my family dynamic had finally become a matter of consequences. Rebecca straightened, wiped under her eyes once, and spoke like someone making a decision that would be discussed for years. Tomorrow night, she said, I'm going to introduce you to the people Derek said you were not at the level to meet. And he can stand there and watch what it looks like when the truth enters the room. The next night, the National Gallery's rotunda glowed the way power always does in Washington, warm light on cold stone elegance designed to make everyone inside feel inevitable. 200 guests moved in carefully curated clusters, museum directors from 6 continents, ambassadors, arts leaders, congressional staffers who could approve or bury funding with a single line in a bill. This wasn't a party. It was soft diplomacy, dressed up as champagne. I arrived early in a midnight blue gown that made me feel like myself, not because it was glamorous, but because it was armor. Tonight, my job was to welcome the world and make the right introductions, to hold an invisible web of relationships steady so the summit could do what it was meant to do, keep culture alive in an era that treated truth like a luxury. When the first delegations arrived, I did what I always did. I shook hands. I remembered names. I translated priorities. I made small talk that carried real stakes. Then, at 7, Rebecca walked in with Derek at her side, and for the first time, I saw my brother stripped of his usual confidence. He looked like a man who'd suddenly realized the room had been real all along. Rebecca's smile was professional, but her eyes were sharp with purpose. She found me during a lull, and the moment was quiet enough to feel intimate despite the crowd. Dr. Mitchell, she said formally, then softened. You look incredible. Derek stood there staring like he was meeting a stranger he'd ignored for years. I read everything he blurted, voice too loud and too honest. Your bio? Your book, the articles? I spent hours. I didn't know. I'm an idiot. I should have felt satisfied, but what I felt was something heavier and cleaner relief that the lie was dying in public. Before I could respond, the Smithsonian secretary approached and nodded toward the stage. It was time. I walked to the microphone, looked out at the room, and began the remarks I'd written to sound effortless. I spoke about museums as memory, as science, as diplomacy. I spoke about climate change and repatriation, and digital access, about the responsibility to preserve the past without turning it into a weapon. Then I introduced the keynote speaker, stepped back, and returned to the floor where the real work happened. Over the next 2 hours, Rebecca did exactly what she promised. She guided Derek through the room like a correction in motion, introducing me to people he once thought were out of my league and letting him watch as they greeted me like a peer. Senator Williams, Rebecca said at one point, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She's the executive director hosting the summit and one of the sharpest cultural policy minds in the city. The senator's face lit with recognition and interest, and Derek's expression tightened as the weight of his mistake settled into his bones. Near the end of the evening, a European director pulled me aside and proposed something that made my heart pause: a rotating summit, an organizing committee, and me as chair. It was the kind of professional payoff that didn't look like revenge but felt like justice anyway. When the last guest drifted out and the rotunda emptied into quiet, Derek found me near the exit. His voice was low now, stripped of performance. Can we start over? Can I learn who you actually are? I held his gaze and felt the years of being minimized stack up behind my ribs like sediment. Part of me wanted to say no to protect myself with distance the way I'd learned to. But another part of me, the part that still believed in restoration, understood something simple. This wasn't a victory that required destruction. It was a victory that required truth. We can start over, I said, but it has to be real. Not guilt, not optics, presence. Derek nodded hard, like he'd finally found the right word for what he'd been missing. Outside, the city hummed with its usual ambition, and inside my chest there was a quieter hum, something like closure, something like possibility. I didn't win by humiliating him. I won by refusing to stay small. And the lesson that lingered was the one I wished my family had learned earlier. The people closest to you don't need you to be less so they can feel like more. They need to see you clearly. So, here's the question. I can't stop thinking about if you were in my position. Would you choose the clean comfort of cutting someone off, or the harder path of letting them earn their way back into your life? One honest question at a time.